Okay, so now we're going to talk about uh, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. Um, and I would imagine that for many of you, of all the materials that we've read for this course, this essay might be the most familiar. It's very popularly read in a lot of history courses, even in high school. And it's a really important document that relates to the civil rights movement in the United States. It also relates to arguments on behalf of civil disobedience just as a political tactic, and it's a really important political document in general. It also has what I think it includes some important philosophical arguments related to sort of maybe philosophy of law, or also I think related very clearly to some ideas of moral progress, again, theories of civil disobedience, etc. And so I think it fits nicely in this unit. First, a little bit about the context in which he was writing this. So he writes this letter in 1963, and he is in solitary confinement in Birmingham, Alabama. So he had gone down to Birmingham, Alabama to work with some civil rights campaigns, to engage in civil disobedience, because at the time, Birmingham was, especially in the summer of 1963, was extremely racially divided and a very violent place. So that summer in particular, many black churches and homes were being bombed. And so Martin Luther King was arrested at a protest and received really harsh treatment and was thrown into solitary confinement. And during this time, so a group of 8 white clergymen, I think some from Alabama, maybe some from the South more generally, but they published an open letter in one of the newspapers called A Call for Unity. And in this letter, they criticized Martin Luther King and his methods of seeking progress. And so they sort of acknowledge, they say, look, there are injustices that need to be remedied, but, black people need to just be patient, and you need to actually use the court system to navigate this or to battle against racial segregation. You shouldn't be in the streets protesting or saying anything divisive or being too aggressive about your calls for justice. And so I think Martin Luther King's lawyer brings this into him, and he is then inspired to write this letter from Birmingham jail as a response to this letter call for unity by these white Southern church leaders. And so he argues against this idea of just waiting for progress to occur, this assumption that moral progress is kind of inevitable and that the courts will be a sort of good means through which to achieve this. And so he lists a number of injustices, just ongoing injustices, kind of reminding those white clergy members of the gravity of the situation. And he sort of criticizes them and says, if you've never felt the pain of segregation, it's much easier to just say wait. And he says that there's this myth, quote unquote, myth concerning time among white moderates in which they assume that moral progress towards equal rights is just inevitable. And because of this assumption, they critique any kind of activism that they find too aggressive or too assertive, and they say that it's unnecessary. And Martin Luther King says that this is a completely wrong misconception of time in general, and it's wrong and borderline insulting to assume that just the passage of time will inevitably just like cure these serious injustices. And so he says progress doesn't just take time, it takes effort. It takes, in fact, tireless, relentless effort from people who are committed to the cause. And so that's one way in which this conjures these ideas of moral progress and critiques some, I think, fairly commonly held beliefs that I think are probably still very relevant today, in which people think, well, why don't you just wait? The history has been one in which moral progress has occurred over time, just sort of naturally. And so if you just wait it out, then these injustices will over time sort of remedy themselves. So he says that is absolutely false. Another important argument that he has in this letter is that we actually have a moral imperative to disobey unjust laws. And so he famously references St. Augustine, who says an unjust law is no law at all. And this is just to sort of bolster this legal argument, or this idea that actually we need to disobey these laws that continue to segregate and harm people. And that is sort of a theoretical stance that, a strong stance that he takes on that, and also is another way of sort of rebutting this idea that the only way to achieve progress is going through just purely legal means, meaning just go to law school and argue your case in front of various courts and fight it out through various legal battles. He says that is simply not going to cut it. So he also offers a famous critique of the position of white moderates. And so the people, these Christian clergymen who are writing this call for unity, they acknowledge, like I say, they acknowledge in their letter that there is injustice going on, but they just say, you got to take it easy. You can't, protest this as aggressively as you are, and you can't use these methods because actually you're making things worse. Actually, it's more divisive and blah, blah, blah. And so he says that there's this idea that this shallow understanding from people who, think, hey, I'm not racist, and yeah, I can see that there's injustice going on, but this sort of lukewarm acceptance is worse than just outright rejection. And so in some ways he'd say, I would prefer to have a more virulent racist say, I hate you because of your race, than someone who says, no, I don't hate you. In fact, I accept you, and I see that your concerns are legitimate. I just don't support your methods, and I actually don't think that it's as big a deal as you're making it. And so he asserts in his letter that the white church needs to take a very principled stance on segregation, or he says risk being dismissed as just an irrelevant social club. And so he uses this also to sort of encourage the Black community to avoid complacency and to avoid what he calls do-nothingism, and to also avoid slipping into just pure despair or hatred, because it's sort of immobilizing. And so much of what he is concerned with in this letter seems to be motivating people to continue in this struggle, and also critiquing those who, what he says, have this sort of misunderstanding of time and how progress occurs. And so I think a clear implication of his letter that follows, or that is in line with many of Moody Adams' argument, is this idea that moral progress isn't a static achievement. And it's not something that once achieved, you're just like, okay, great, now we're done. It must be continually achieved and continually fought for. And to have any kind of change, it requires a lot of courage and a lot of sacrifice. And so I guess in your discussion posts or in your thinking about this, I encourage you to think about whether a belief in, these different kind of views on how one might take the concept of moral progress, and sort of how different ways of conceptualizing moral progress might alleviate one from even taking any kind of moral responsibility, or how it might motivate one to take on even more moral responsibility. It might motivate someone to agitate for social change, and just maybe think about, I also think it's really interesting to think about whether King's critiques of the white moderates of the time hold up in the political landscape today. And so you might take some time to reflect on your sort of view of the current political landscape and whether you think that those arguments still apply.